my tea time tale friends. I hope you are all having a fabulous Saturday afternoon or morning or evening, depending on where you are. It has gotten really cold over here, so I am bundled up and I've got a nice cup of hot chocolate. Keep me nice and cozy. What is everybody else drinking today? We having tea? We having coffee? What's going on? I'm very excited about this book. This is actually a whole book here. You can see the cover here. The Book of Dragons by Edith Nesbit. This was actually published in 1899 originally. So it's an interesting, kind of transition from Victorian era, Edwardian era into the kind of modern era. So I'm very excited to read these with you today. And of course, who doesn't love dragons, right? You've got water? Okay, water's good. You gotta hydrate. Gotta stay hydrated. You know what? I'll have a sip of my water too. Rhea, you've got tea? Excellent, excellent. Yeah, I don't know. I just felt an urge for hot chocolate today. It was just what the mood called for. But all right, let us jump right in because I'm super excited about these stories. So here we go. So again, this is The Book of Dragons by Edith Nesbit, and we are starting with Uncle James or the Purple Stranger. The princess and the gardener's boy were playing in the backyard. "What will you do when you grow up, princess?" asked the gardener's boy. "I should like to marry you, Tom," said the princess. "Would you mind?" "No," said the gardener's boy. "I shouldn't mind much. I'll marry you, if you like, if I have time." For the gardener's boy meant, as soon as he was grown up, to be a general and a poet and a prime minister and an admiral and a civil engineer. Meanwhile, he was top of all his classes at school and tip-top of the geography class. As for the Princess Marianne, she was a good little girl, and everyone loved her. She was always kind and polite, even to her Uncle James and to other people whom she did not like very much. And though she was not very clever, for a princess she always tried to do her lessons. Even if you know perfectly well that you can't do your lessons, you may as well try, and sometimes you find that by some fortunate accident they really are done. Then the princess had a truly good heart. She was always kind to her pets. She never slapped her hippopotamus when it broke her dolls in its playful gambols. She never forgot to feed her rhinoceroses in their little hutch in the backyard. Her elephant was devoted to her, and sometimes Marianne made her nurse quite cross by smuggling the dear little thing up to bed with her and letting it go to sleep with its long trunk laid lovingly across her throat and its pretty head cuddled right under the royal ear. I can't. I'm already in love with this story. When the princess had been good all through the week, for like all real live nice children, she was sometimes naughty but never bad, Nurse would allow her to ask her little friends to come on Wednesday morning early and spend the day, because Wednesday is the end of the week in that country. Then, in the afternoon, when all the little dukes and duchesses and marquises and countesses had finished their rice pudding and had had their hands and faces washed after it, Nurse would say, "Now, my dears, what would you like to do this afternoon?" just as if she didn't know. And the answer would always be the same. "Oh, do let's go to the zoological gardens and ride on the big guinea pig and feed the rabbits and hear the dormouse asleep." So their pinafores were taken off, and they all went to the zoological gardens, where 20 of them could ride at a time on the guinea pig, and where even the little ones could feed the great rabbits if some grown-up person were kind enough to lift them up for the purpose. There always was some such person, because in Rotundia everybody was kind, except one. Now that you have read as far as this, you know, of course, that the kingdom of Rotundia was a very remarkable place, and if you are a thoughtful child, as of course you are, you will not need me to tell you what was the most remarkable thing about it. But in case you are not a thoughtful child, and it is just possible, of course, that you are not, I will tell you at once what the most remarkable thing was. All the animals were the wrong sizes. And this was how it happened. In olden times, when all our world was just loose earth and air and fire and water, mixed up anyhow like a pudding, and spinning around like mad, trying to get the different things to settle in their proper places, a round piece of earth got loose and went spinning away by itself across the water, which was just beginning to try to get spread out smooth into a real sea. And as the great round piece of earth flew away, going around and around as hard as it could, it met a long piece of hard rock that had got loose from another part of the puddingy mixture. And the rock was so hard and was going so fast that it ran its point through the round piece of earth and stuck out on the other side of it, so that the two together were very much like a much too big spinning top. I am afraid all this is very dull, but you know geography is never quite lively, and after all I must give you a little information, even in a fairy tale, like the powder in jam. Well, when the pointed rock smashed into the round bit of earth, the shock was so great that it set them spinning together through the air, which was just getting into its proper place like all the rest of the things, only as luck would have it, they forgot which way around they had been going, and began to spin around the wrong way. Presently, Center of Gravity, a great giant who was managing the whole business, woke up in the middle of the earth and began to grumble. "Hurry up," he said. "Come down and lie still, can't you?" So the rock with the round piece of earth fell into the sea, and the point of the rock went into a hole that just fitted it in the stony sea bottom, and there it spun around the wrong way 7 times, and then lay still. And that round piece of land became, after millions of years, the Kingdom of Rotundia. This is the end of the geography lesson, and now for just a little natural history, so that we may not feel that we are quite wasting our time. Of course, the consequence of the island having spun around the wrong way was that when the animals began to grow on the island, they all grew the wrong sizes. The guinea pig, as you know, was as big as our elephants, and the elephant, dear little pet, was the size of a silly tiny black and tan dog that ladies carry sometimes in their muffs. The rabbits were about the size of our rhinoceroses, and all about the wild parts of the island they had made their burrows as big as railway tunnels. The dormouse, of course, was the biggest of all the creatures. I can't tell you how big he was. Even if you think of elephants, it will not help you at all. Luckily, there was only one of him, and he was always asleep. Otherwise, I don't think the Rotundians could have borne with him. As it was, they made him a house, and it saved the expense of a brass band, because no band could possibly have been heard when the dormouse was talking in his sleep. The men and women and children in this wonderful island were quite the right size, because their ancestors had come over with the Conqueror long after the island had settled down and the animals grown on it. Now the natural history lesson is over, and if you have been attending, you know more about Rotundia than anyone there did, except 3 people. The Lord Chief Schoolmaster, the princess's uncle, who was a magician and knew everything without learning it, and Tom, the gardener's son. Tom had learned more at school than anyone else because he wished to take a prize. The prize offered by the Lord Chief Schoolmaster was a History of Rotundia, beautifully bound with the royal arms on the back. But after that day when the princess said she meant to marry Tom, the gardener's boy thought it over, and he decided that the best prize in the world would be the princess, and this was the prize Tom meant to take. And when you are a gardener's son and have decided to marry a princess, you will find the more you learn at school, the better. The princess always played with Tom on the days when the little dukes and marquises did not come to tea, and when he told her he was almost sure of the first prize, she clapped her hands and said, "Dear Tom, dear good, clever Tom, you deserve all the prizes, and I will give you my pet elephant, and you can keep him till we're married." Oh, what a lovely engagement present, a pet elephant. Wouldn't you just? I think an elephant would be a marvelous little pet. The pet elephant was called Fido, and the gardener's son took him away in his coat pocket. He was the dearest little elephant you ever saw, about 6 inches long. But he was very, very wise. He could not have been wiser if he was a mile high. He lay down comfortably in Tom's pocket, and when Tom put in his hand, Fido curled his little trunk around Tom's fingers with an affectionate confidence that made the boy's heart warm to his new little pet. What with the elephant and Princess's affection and the knowledge that the very next day he would receive the history of Rotunda, beautifully bound with the royal arms on the cover, Tom could hardly speak a wink. Sleep a wink, even. And besides, the dog did bark so terribly. There was only one dog in Rotundia. The kingdom could not afford to keep more than one. He was a Mexican lapdog, of the kind that in most parts of the world only measures 7 inches from the end of his dear nose to the tip of his darling tail. But in Rotundia he was bigger than I can possibly expect you to believe, and when he barked, his bark was so large that it filled up all the night and left no room for sleep or dreams or polite conversation, or anything else at all. He never barked at things that went on in the island. He was too large-minded for that. But when ships went blundering by in the dark, tumbling over the rocks at the end of the island, he would bark once or twice, just to let the ships know that they couldn't come playing about there just as they liked. But on this particular night he barked and barked and barked, and the princess said, oh dear, I wish he wouldn't. I am so sleepy." And Tom said to himself, "I wonder whatever's the matter. As soon as it's light, I'll go and see." So when it began to be pretty pink and yellow daylight, Tom got up and went out. And all the time the Mexican lapdog barked so that the houses shook and the tiles on the roof of the palace rattled like milk cans in a cart whose horse is Frisky. "I'll go to the pillar," thought Tom, as he went through town. The pillar, of course, was the top of the piece of rock that had stuck itself through Rotundia millions of years ago, and made it spin around the wrong way. It was quite in the middle of the island, and stuck up ever so far, and when you were at the top you could see a great deal farther than when you were not. I think that's how that works, generally speaking. If you go higher up, you can see farther out. I think that's just how it works. Okay. As Tom went out from the town and across the downs, he thought what a pretty sight it was to see the rabbits in the bright dewy morning, frisking with their young ones by the mouths of their burrows. He did not go very near the rabbits, of course, because when a rabbit of that size is at play, it does not always look where it is going, and it might easily have crushed Tom with its foot, and then it would have been very sorry afterward. And Tom was a kind boy, and would not have liked to make even a rabbit unhappy. Earwigs in our country often get out of the way when they think you're going to walk on them. They too have kind hearts, and they would not like you to be sorry afterward. I don't know that I would necessarily be sorry after stepping on an earwig. I might be a little disturbed. So Tom went on, looking at the rabbits and watching the morning grow more and more red and golden, and the Mexican lapdog barked all the time till the church bells tinkled and the chimney of the apple factory rocked again. But when Tom got to the pillar, he saw that he would not need to climb to the top to find out what the dog was barking at. For there by the pillar lay a very large, purple dragon. His wings were like old purple umbrellas that have been very much rained on, and his head was large and bald, like the top of a purple toadstool, and his tail, which was purple too, was very, very, very long, and thin and tight, like the lash of a carriage whip. It was licking one of its purple umbrella-y wings, and every now and then it moaned and leaned its head back against the rocky pillar, as though it felt faint. Tom saw at once what had happened. A flight of purple dragons must have crossed the island in the night, and this poor one must have knocked its wing and broken it against the pillar. Everyone is kind to everyone in Rotundia, and Tom was not afraid of the dragon, although he had never spoken to one before. He had often watched them flying across the sea, but he had never expected to get to know one personally. So now he said, "I'm afraid you don't feel quite well." The dragon shook his large purple head. He could not speak, but like all other animals, he could understand well enough when he liked. "Can I get you anything?" asked Tom politely. The dragon opened his purple eyes with an inquiring smile. "A bun or two now," said Tom coaxingly. "There's a beautiful bun tree quite close." The dragon opened a great purple mouth and licked his purple lips, so Tom ran and shook the bun tree, and soon came back with an armful of fresh currant buns, and as he came he picked a few of the Bath kind, which grow on the low bushes near the pillar. Because, of course, another consequence of the island's having spun the wrong way is that all the things we have to make, buns and cakes and shortbread, grow on trees and bushes. But in Rotundia, they have to make their cauliflowers and cabbages and carrots and apples and onions, just as our cooks make puddings and turnovers. If I had a shortbread tree in my backyard, I would eat nothing but shortbread. I'm just saying. That sounds ideal. I'm moving to Rotundia. Tom gave all the buns to the dragon, saying, "Here, try to eat a little. You'll soon feel better then." The dragon ate up the buns, nodded rather ungraciously, and began to lick his wing again. So Tom left him and went back to the town with the news, and everyone was so excited at a real live dragon's being on the island, a thing that had never happened before, that they all went out to look at it, instead of going to the prize-giving, and the Lord Chief Schoolmaster went with the rest. Now, he had Tom's prize, the History of Rotundia, in his pocket, the one bound in calf with the royal arms on the cover, and it happened to drop out, and the dragon ate it, so Tom never got the prize after all. But the dragon, when he had gotten it, did not like it. "Perhaps it's all for the best," said Tom. "I might not have liked that prize either if I had gotten it." It happened to be a Wednesday, so when the princess's friends were asked what they would like to do, all the little dukes and marquises and earls said, "Let's go and see the dragon." But the little duchesses and marchionesses and countesses said they were afraid. Then Princess Marianne spoke up royally and said, "Don't be silly, because it's only in fairy stories and histories of England and things like that people are unkind and want to hurt each other. In Rotundia, everyone is kind, and no one has anything to be afraid of unless they're naughty, and then we know it's for our own good. Let's all go and see the dragon. We might take him some acid drops." Okay. First of all, burn on England. Second of all, what are acid drops and why are we dropping acid with dragons? This doesn't seem... I need a sip of hot chocolate. Okay. So they're going to take the dragon some acid drops, apparently. Maybe they mean like, oh, acid, like indigestion, like Tums. They're bringing the dragon Tums. We'll say that's what it is. Anyway, so they went. And all the titled children took it in turns to feed the dragon with acid drops. And he seemed pleased and flattered and wagged as much of his purple tail as he could get at conveniently. For it was a very, very long tail indeed. But when it came to the princess's turn to give an acid drop to the dragon, he smiled very wide and wagged his tail to the very last long inch of it, as much as to say, "Oh, you nice, kind, pretty little princess." But deep down in his wicked purple heart he was saying, "Oh, you nice, fat, pretty little princess. I should like to eat you instead of these silly acid drops." But of course nobody heard him except the princess's uncle, and he was a magician and accustomed to listening at doors. It was part of his trade. Now, you will remember that I told you there was one wicked person in Rotundia, and I cannot conceal from you any longer that this complete bad was the princess's Uncle James. Magicians are always bad, as you know from your fairy books, and some uncles are bad, as you see by Babes in the Wood or the Norfolk tragedy, and one James at least was bad, as you have learned from your English history. And when anyone is a magician and is also an uncle and is named James as well, you need not expect anything nice from him. He is a threefold complete bad, and he will come to no good. Uncle James had long wanted to get rid of the princess and have the kingdom to himself. He did not like many things, A nice kingdom was almost the only thing he cared for. But he had never seen his way quite clearly, because everyone is so kind in Rotundia that wicked spells will not work there, but run off those blameless islanders like water off a duck's back. Now, however, Uncle James thought there might be a chance for him, because he knew that now there were two wicked people on the island who could stand by each other, himself and the dragon. He said nothing, but he exchanged a meaningful glance with the dragon, and everyone went home to tea. And no one had seen the meaningful glance except Tom. Tom went home and told his elephant all about it. The intelligent little creature listened carefully, then climbed from Tom's knee to the table, on which stood an ornamental calendar that the princess had given Tom for a Christmas present. With its tiny trunk, the elephant pointed out a date, the 15th of August, the princess's birthday, and looked anxiously at its master. "What is it, Fido, good little elephant, then?" said Tom. And the sagacious animal repeated its former gesture. Then Tom understood. "Oh, something is to happen on her birthday. All right, I'll be on the lookout." And he was. At first, the people of Rotundia were quite pleased by the dragon, who lived by the pillar and fed himself from the bun trees, but by and by he began to wander. He would creep into the burrows made by the great rabbits, and excursionists, sporting on the downs, would see his long, tight, whip-like tail wriggling down a burrow and out of sight, and before they had time to say, "There he goes," his ugly purple head would come poking out from another rabbit hole, perhaps just behind them, or laugh softly to itself just in their ears. And the dragon's laugh was not a merry one. This sort of hide-and-seek amused people at first, but by and by it began to get on their nerves. And if you don't know what that means, ask Mother to tell you next time you are playing blind man's buff when she has a headache. Then, the dragon got into the habit of cracking its tail as people crack whips, and this also got on people's nerves. Then, too, little things began to be missed. And you know how unpleasant that is, even in a private school, and in a public kingdom it is, of course, much worse. The things that were missed were nothing much at first, a few little elephants, a hippopotamus or two, or some giraffes and things like that. It was nothing much, as I say, but it made people feel uncomfortable. Then one day, a favorite rabbit of the princess's, called Frederick, mysteriously disappeared. And then came a terrible morning, when the Mexican lapdog was missing. He had barked ever since the dragon came to the island, and people had grown quite used to the noise. So when his barking suddenly ceased, it woke everybody up, and they all went out to see what was the matter. And the lapdog was gone. A boy was sent to wake the army, so that it might look for him. But the army was gone too, and now the people began to be frightened. Then Uncle James came out onto the terrace of the palace, and he made the people a speech. He said, "Friends, fellow citizens, I cannot disguise from myself or from you that this purple dragon is a poor, penniless exile, a helpless alien in our midst, and besides he is no end of a dragon." And the people thought of the dragon's tail and said, "Hear, hear." Uncle James went on. "Something has happened to a gentle and defenseless member of our community. We don't know what has happened." Everyone thought of the rabbit named Frederick and groaned. "The defenses of our country have been swallowed up," said Uncle James. Everyone thought of the poor army. There was only one thing to be done. Uncle James was warming to his subject. Could we ever forgive ourselves if by neglecting a simple precaution we lost more rabbits, or even perhaps our navy, our police, and our fire brigade? For I warn you that the purple dragon will respect nothing, however sacred. Everyone thought of themselves, and they said, "What is the simple precaution?" Then Uncle James said, "Tomorrow is the dragon's birthday. He is accustomed to have a present on his birthday. If he gets a nice present, he will be in a hurry to take it away and show it to his friends, and he will fly off and never come back. The crowd cheered wildly, and the princess from her balcony clapped her hands. "The present the dragon expects," said Uncle James cheerfully, "is rather an expensive one. But when we give it, it should not be in a grudging spirit, especially to visitors. What the dragon wants is a princess. We have only one princess, it is true, but far be it from us to display a miserly temper. But far be it from us to display a miserly temper at such a moment. And the gift is worthless that costs the giver nothing. Your readiness to give up your princess will only show how generous you are." The crowd began to cry, for they loved their princess, though they quite saw that their first duty was to be generous and give the poor dragon what he wanted. I don't know. I'm feeling a little bit reminded of our lovely Greek myths from last week. Yes, let us give the monster our princess. Let's see what good comes of this. Yes. The princess began to cry because she did not want to be anybody's birthday present, especially a purple dragon's. And Tom began to cry because he was so angry. He went straight home and told his little elephant, and the elephant cheered him up so much that presently the two grew quite absorbed in a top that the elephant was spinning with his little trunk. Easily distracted, are we, Tom? Early in the morning, Tom went to the palace. He looked out across the downs. There were hardly any rabbits prancing there now. And then he gathered white roses and threw them at the princess's window till she woke up and looked out. "Come up and kiss me," she said. So Tom climbed up the white rosebush and kissed the princess through the window and said, "Many happy returns of the day." Then Mary Ann began to cry and said, "Oh, Tom, how can you, when you know quite well—" "Oh, don't." You're right, Sarah. I mean, it's an elephant with a top. Like, what can you do? "Oh, don't," said Tom. "Why, Mary Ann, my precious, my princess, what do you think I should be doing while the dragon was getting his birthday present? Don't cry, my own little Mary Ann. Fido and I have arranged everything. You've only got to do as you are told." "Is that all?" said the princess. "Oh, that's easy. I've often done that." Then Tom told her what she was to do, and she kissed him again and again. "Oh, you dear, good, clever Tom," she said. "How glad I am that I gave you Fido. You two have saved me, you dears." The next morning, Uncle James put on his best coat and hat and the vest with the gold snakes on it. He was a magician, and he had a bright taste in vests. And he called with a cab to take the princess out. "Come, little birthday present," he said tenderly. "The dragon will be so pleased. And I'm glad to see you're not crying. You know, my child, we cannot begin too young to learn to think of the happiness of others rather than our own. I should not like my dear little niece to be selfish, or to wish to deny a trivial pleasure to a poor, sick dragon far from his home and friends." The princess said she would try not to be selfish. Presently the cab drew up near the pillar, and there was the dragon, his ugly purple head shining in the sun, and his ugly purple mouth half open. Uncle James said, "Good morning, sir. We have brought you a small present for your birthday. We do not like to let such an anniversary go by without some suitable testimonial, especially to one who is a stranger in our midst. Our means are small, but our hearts are large. We have but one princess, but we give her freely. Do we not, my child?" The princess said she supposed so, and the dragon came a little nearer. Suddenly, a voice cried, "Run!" And there was Tom, and he had brought the zoological guinea pig and a pair of Belgian hares with him. "Just to see fair," said Tom. Uncle James was furious. "What do you mean, sir," he cried, "by intruding on a state function with your common rabbits and things? Go away, naughty little boy, and play with them somewhere else." But while he was speaking, the rabbits had come up on either side of him, their great sides towering ever so high, and now they pressed him between them so that he was buried in their thick fur and almost choked. The princess, meantime, had run to the other side of the pillar, and was peeping around it to see what was going on. A crowd had followed the cab out of town. Now they reached the scene of the state function, and they all cried out, "Fair play, play fair, we can't go back on our word like this. Give a thing and take a thing, why it's never done. Let the poor exiled stranger dragon have his birthday present." And they tried to get at Tom, but the guinea pig stood in the way. "Yes," Tom cried, "fair play is a jewel, and your helpless exile shall have the princess, if he can catch her. Now then, Marianne." Marianne looked around the big pillar and called to the dragon, "Bo, you can't catch me," and she began to run as fast as she ever could, and the dragon ran after her. When the princess had run a half-mile, she stopped, dodged around a tree, and ran back to the pillar and around it, and the dragon after her. You see, he was so long he could not turn as quickly as she could. Around and around the pillar ran the princess. The first time she ran around a long way from the pillar, and then nearer and nearer, with the dragon after her all the time. And he was so busy trying to catch her that he never noticed that Tom had tied the very end of his long, tight, whipcordy tail around the pillar. It was exactly like winding a top, only the peg was the pillar and the dragon's tail was the string, and the magician was safe between the Belgian hares and couldn't see anything but darkness or do anything but choke. When the dragon was wound onto the pillar as much as he possibly could be, and as tight like a cotton on a reel, the princess stopped running, and though she had very little breath left, she managed to say, "Ha! Who's won now?" This annoyed the dragon so much that he put out all his strength, spread his great purple wings, and tried to fly at her. Of course, this pulled his tail, and pulled it very hard, so hard that as he pulled, the tail had to come. And the pillar had to come around with the tail, and the island had to come around with the pillar, and in another minute the tail was loose, and the island was spinning around exactly like a top. It spun so fast that everyone fell flat on their faces and held on tight to themselves, because they felt something was going to happen. All but the magician, who was choking between the Belgian hares and felt nothing but fur and fury. And something did happen. The dragon had sent the kingdom of Rotundia spinning the way it ought to have gone at the beginning of the world. And as it spun around, all the animals began to change sizes. The guinea pigs got small, and the elephants got big, and the men and women and children would have changed sizes too if they had not had the sense to hold on to themselves, very tight indeed with both hands, which of course the animals could not be expected to know how to do. And the best of it was that when the small beasts got big and the big beasts got small, the dragon got small too, and fell at the princess's feet, a little crawling purple newt with wings. "Funny little thing," said the princess when she saw it. "I will take it for a birthday present." But while all the people were still on their faces, holding on tight to themselves, Uncle James the magician never thought of holding tight. He only thought of how to punish Belgian hares and the sons of gardeners. So when the big beasts grew small, he grew small with the other beasts, and the little purple dragon, when he fell at the princess's feet, saw there was a very small magician named Uncle James, and the dragon took him because it wanted a birthday present. So now all the animals were new sizes. And at first it seemed very strange to everyone to have great lumbering elephants and a tiny little dormouse, but they have gotten used to it now, and think no more of it than we do. All this happened several years ago, and the other day I saw in the Rotundia Times an account of the wedding of the princess with Lord Thomas Gardner, K.C.D., and I knew she could not have married anyone but Tom, so I suppose they made him a lord on purpose for the wedding. And K.C.D., of course, means clever conqueror of the dragon. If you think that is wrong, it is only because you don't know how they spell in Rotundia. The paper said that among the beautiful presents of the bridegroom to the bride was an enormous elephant, on which the bridal pair made their wedding tour. This must have been Fido. You remember Tom promised to give him back to the princess when they were married. The Rotundia Times called the married couple the happy pair. It was clever of the paper to think of calling them that. It is a pretty and novel expression, and I think it is truer than many of the things you see in papers. Because, you see, the princess and the gardener's son were so fond of each other they could not help being happy. And besides, they had an elephant of their very own to ride on. If that is not enough to make people happy, I should like to know what is. Though, of course, I know there are some people who could not be happy unless they had a whale to sail on, and perhaps not even then. But they are greedy, grasping people, the kind who would take 4 helps of pudding, as likely as not, which neither Tom nor Mary Ann ever did. 4 helps of pudding. That's a lot of pudding, if I must say so myself. Well, I am delighted with this book, I must say. I'm so glad that I got it. Again, it was published in 1899, and I can see here that Edith maybe has some disdain for her country of origin, a little bit of, ribbing at the state of England. But I'm enjoying it very much. It's very British. It feels very, very British. I'm glad you guys liked it. I am very much enjoying this. It's going to be fun to see what else we have. Let's see. I don't think I'll make it through all 8 of them. That was quite a time for one story, but let's move on to the next one. I'm just going to adjust this here. I've got a little... It's like a cooler Rudyard Kipling. That's good. I like that. All right, I'm just going to take this off. Don't mind me. I'm just an old lady with a little arthritis in my hands. But it's a little difficult to hold the book with this. So I'm just going to set that aside. It's a bigger book than I expected. As you can see, it's a big book. All right. Let's move on to the next one now. The Deliverers of Their Country. That's a good name. It all began with Effie's getting something in her eye. It hurt very much indeed, and it felt something like a red-hot spark, only it seemed to have legs as well, and wings like a fly. Effie rubbed and cried, not real crying, but the kind your eye does all by itself without you being miserable inside your mind. And then she went to her father to have the thing in her eye taken out. Effie's father was a doctor, so of course he knew how to take things out of eyes. He did it very cleverly, with a soft paintbrush dipped in castor oil. When he had gotten the thing out, he said, "This is very curious." Effie had often got things in her eye before, and her father had always seemed to think it was natural, rather tiresome and naughty things perhaps, but still natural. He had never before thought it curious. Effie stood holding her handkerchief to her eye and said, "I don't believe it's out." People always say this when they've had something in their eye. "Oh yes, it's out," said the doctor. "Here it is on the brush. This is very interesting." Effie had never heard her father say that about anything she had any share in. She said, "What?" The doctor carried the brush very carefully across the room and held the point of it under his microscope. Then he twisted the brass screws of the microscope and looked through the top with one eye. "Dear me," he said, dear me. 4 well-developed limbs, a long caudal appendage, 5 toes unequal in length, almost like one of the Lacertidae, yet there are traces of wings." The creature under his eye wriggled a little in the castor oil, and he went on. "Yes, a bat-like wing. A new specimen, undoubtedly. Effie, run around to the professor and ask him to be kind enough to step in for a few minutes." "You might give me 6pence, Daddy," said Effie, "because I did bring you the new specimen. I took great care of it inside my eye, and my eye does hurt." The doctor was so pleased with the new specimen that he gave Effie a shilling, and presently the professor stepped round. He stayed to lunch, and he and the doctor quarreled very happily all the afternoon about the name and the family of the thing that had come out of Effie's eye. But at tea time, another thing happened. Effie's brother fished something out of his tea, which he thought at first was an earwig. He was just getting ready to drop it on the floor and end its life in the usual way, when it shook itself in the spoon, spread 2 wet wings, and flopped onto the tablecloth. There it sat, stroking itself with its feet and stretching its wings, and Harry said, "Why, it's a tiny newt." The professor leaned forward before the doctor could say a word. "I'll give you half a crown for it, Harry, my lad," he said, speaking very fast. Then he picked it up carefully in his handkerchief. "It's a new specimen," he said, "and finer than yours, doctor." It was a tiny lizard, about half an inch long, with scales and wings. So now the doctor and the professor each had a specimen, and they were both very pleased. But before long these specimens began to seem less valuable, for the next morning when the knife boy was cleaning the doctor's boots, he suddenly dropped the brushes and the boot and the blacking and screamed out that he was burnt. And from inside the boot came crawling a lizard as big as a kitten, with large shiny wings. "Why," said Effie, "I know what that is. It is like a dragon, like the one St. George killed." And Effie was right. That afternoon Towser was bitten in the garden by a dragon about the size of a rabbit, which he had tried to chase. And the next morning all the papers were full of the wonderful winged lizards that were appearing all over the country. The papers would not call them dragons, because of course no one believes in dragons nowadays. And at any rate, the papers were not going to be so silly as to believe in fairy stories. At first there were only a few, but in a week or two the country was simply running alive with dragons of all sizes, and in the air you could sometimes see them as thick as a swarm of bees. They all looked alike except as to size. They were green, with scales, and they had 4 legs and a long tail and great wings like bats' wings, only the wings were pale, half-transparent yellow, like the gearboxes on bicycles. She does such funny little metaphors, like the gearboxes on bicycles. Okay. They breathed fire and smoke, as all proper dragons must, but still the newspapers went on pretending they were lizards, until the editor of the Standard was picked up and carried away by a very large one, and then the other newspaper people had not anyone left to tell them what they ought not to believe. So when the largest elephant in the zoo was carried off by a dragon, the papers gave up pretending and put a alarming plague of dragons at the top of the paper. You have no idea how alarming it was, and at the same time how aggravating. The large-sized dragons were terrible, certainly, but when once you found out that the dragons always went to bed early because they were afraid of the chill night air, you had only to stay indoors all day, and you were pretty safe from the big ones. But the smaller sizes were a perfect nuisance. The ones as big as earwigs got in the soap, and they got in the butter. The ones as big as dogs got in the bath, and the fire and smoke inside them made them steam like anything when the cold water tap was turned on, so that careless people were often scalded quite severely. The ones that were as large as pigeons would get into work baskets or corner drawers and bite you when you were in a hurry to get a needle or a handkerchief. The ones as big as sheep were easier to avoid because you could see them coming, but when they flew in at the windows and curled up under your eiderdown, and you did not find them till you went to bed, it was always a shock. The ones this size did not eat people, only lettuce, but they always scorched the sheets and pillowcases dreadfully. Of course, the city council and the police did everything that could be done. It was no use offering the hand of the princess to anyone who killed a dragon. This was all very well in olden times, when there was only one dragon and one princess. But now there were far more dragons than princesses, although the royal family was a large one. And besides, it would have been a mere waste of princesses to offer rewards for killing dragons, because everybody killed as many dragons as they quite could out of their own heads and without rewards at all, just to get the nasty things out of the way. The county council undertook to cremate all dragons delivered at their offices between the hours of 10 and 2, and whole wagon-loads and cart-loads and truckloads of dead dragons could be seen any day of the week standing in a long line in the street where the county council had their offices. Boys brought barrow-loads of dead dragons, and children on their way home from morning school would call in to leave the handful or two of little dragons they had brought in their satchels or carried in their knotted pocket handkerchiefs. And yet there seemed to be as many dragons as ever. Then the police struck up great wood and canvas towers covered with patent glue. When the dragons flew against these towers, they stuck fast as flies and wasps do on the sticky papers in the kitchen. and when the towers were covered all over with dragons, the police inspector set fire to the towers and burnt them, dragons and all. This is horrifying, I must say. Just, it's a little macabre. And yet, there seemed to be more dragons than ever. The shops were full of patent dragon poison and anti-dragon soap and dragon-proof curtains for the windows, and indeed everything that could be done was done. And yet there seemed to be more dragons than ever. It was not very easy to know what would poison a dragon, because, you see, they ate such different things. The largest kind ate elephants, as long as there were any, and then went on with horses and cows. Another size ate nothing but lilies of the valley, and a third size ate only prime ministers, if they were to be had, and if not, would feed freely on servants in livery. Another size lived on bricks, and 3 of them ate 2/3 of the South Lambeth Infirmary in one afternoon. But the size Effie was most afraid of was about as big as your dining room, and that size ate little girls and boys. At first, Effie and her brother were quite pleased with the change in their lives. It was so amusing to sit up all night instead of going to sleep, and to play in the garden lighted by electric lamps. And it sounded so funny to hear dear mother say, when they were going to bed, "Good night, my darlings. Sleep sound all day, and don't get up too soon. You must not get up before it's quite dark. You wouldn't like the nasty dragons to catch you." That does sound rather nice, actually, to just be able to go to sleep when the sun comes up and just sleep all day. I'm kind of nocturnal. But after a time, they got very tired of it all. They wanted to see the flowers and trees growing in the fields, and to see the pretty sunshine out of doors, and not just through glass windows and patent dragon-proof curtains. And they wanted to play on the grass, which they were not allowed to do in the electric lamp-lighted garden because of the night dew. And they wanted so much to get out, just for once, in the beautiful, bright, dangerous daylight, and they began to try and think of some reason why they ought to go out. Only they did not like to disobey their mother. Exactly, Mango. Absolutely. But one morning, their mother was busy preparing some new dragon poison to lay down in the cellar, and their father was bandaging the hand of the boot boy, which had been scratched by one of the dragons who liked to eat prime ministers when they were to be had, so nobody remembered to say to the children, "Don't get up till it's quite dark." "Go now," said Harry. It would not be disobedient to go, and I know exactly what we ought to do, but I don't know how we ought to do it." "What ought we to do?" said Effie. "We ought to wake St. George, of course," said Harry. "He was the only person in this town who knew how to manage dragons. The people in the fairy tales don't count. But St. George is a real person, and he is only asleep, and he is waiting to be waked up. Only nobody believes in St. George now. I heard Father say so." "We do," said Effie. "Of course we do. And don't you see, Eff, that's the very reason why we could wake him? You can't wake people if you don't believe in them, can you?" Effie said no, but where could they find St. George? "We must go and look," said Harry boldly. "You shall wear a dragon-proof frock made of stuff like the curtains, and I will smear myself all over with the best dragon poison, and—" Effie clapped her hands and skipped with joy and cried, "Oh, Harry, I know where we can find St. George. In St. George's Church, of course." Said Harry, wishing he had thought of that. "You have little sense sometimes for a girl." So the next afternoon, quite early, long before the beams of sunset announced the coming night, when everybody would be up and working, the 2 children got out of bed. Effie wrapped herself in a shawl of dragon-proof muslin. There was no time to make the frock. And Harry made a horrid mess of himself with the patent dragon poison. It was warranted harmless to infants and invalids, so he felt quite safe. What a wonderful pair. Infants and invalids. Excellent. Oh, these old-timey folks. It's a very Sawbones moment. They joined hands and set out to walk to St. George's Church. As you know, there are many St. George's churches, but fortunately they took the turning that leads to the right one, and went along in the bright sunlight, feeling very brave and adventurous. There was no one about in the streets except dragons, and the place was simply swarming with them. Fortunately, none of the dragons were just the right size for eating little boys and girls, or perhaps this story might have to end here. There were dragons on the pavement, and dragons on the roadway, dragons basking on the front doorsteps of public buildings, and dragons preening their wings on the roofs in the hot afternoon sun. The town was quite green with them. Even when the children had gotten out of the town and were walking in the lanes, they noticed the fields on each side were greener than usual, with the scaly legs and tails, and some of the smaller sizes had made themselves asbestos nests in flowering hawthorn hedges. Effie held her brother's hand very tight, and once when a fat dragon flopped against her ear, she screamed out, and a whole flight of green dragons rose from the field at the sound and sprawled away across the sky. The children could hear the rattle of their wings as they flew. "Oh, I want to go home," said Effie. "Don't be silly," said Harry. "Surely you haven't forgotten about the 7 champions and all the princes. People who are going to be their country's deliverers never scream and say they want to go home." "And are we?" asked Effie. "Deliverers, I mean?" "You'll see," said her brother, and on they went. When they came to St. George's Church, they found the door open, and they walked right in, but St. George was not there. So they walked around the churchyard outside, and presently they found the great stone tomb of St. George, with the figure of him carved in marble outside, in his armor and helmet, with his hands folded on his breast. "However can we wake him?" they said. Then Harry spoke to St. George, but he would not answer. And he called, but St. George did not seem to hear. And then he actually tried to waken the great dragon slayer by shaking his marble shoulders. But St. George took no notice. Then Effie began to cry, and put her arms around St. George's neck as well as she could, for the marble, which was very much in the way at the back. She kissed the marble face and said, "Oh, dear, good, kind St. George, please wake up and help us." And at that, St. George opened his eyes sleepily, stretched himself, and said, "What's the matter, little girl?" So the children told him all about it. He turned over in his marble and leaned on one elbow to listen. But when he heard that there were so many dragons, he shook his head. "It's no good," he said. "There would be one too many for poor old George. You should have waked me before. I was always for a fair fight. 1 man, 1 dragon was my motto." Just then a flight of dragons flew overhead, and St. George half drew his sword. But he shook his head again and pushed the sword back as the flight of dragons grew small in the distance. "I can't do anything," he said. "Things have changed since my time. St. Andrew told me about it. They woke him up over the engineers' strike, and he came to talk to me. He says everything is done by machinery now. There must be some way of settling these dragons. By the way, what sort of weather have you been having lately?" This seemed so careless and unkind that Harry would not answer. But Effie said patiently, "It has been very fine. Father says it is the hottest weather there has ever been in this country." "Ah, I guessed as much," said the champion thoughtfully. "Well, the only thing would be, dragons can't stand wet and cold. That's the only thing, if you could find the taps." St. George was beginning to settle down on his stone slab. "Good night. Very sorry I can't help you." And he fell back. "Oh," said St. George, still more sleepily. "And there's a looking-glass, too. It shows you all the world and what's going on. St. Denis told me about it, said it was a very pretty thing." "I'm sorry, I can't. Good night." And he fell back asleep into his marble, and was fast asleep in a moment. "We shall never find the taps," said Harry. "I say, wouldn't it be awful if St. George woke up when there was a dragon near, the size that eats champions?" Effie pulled off her dragon-proof veil. "We didn't meet any the size of the dining-room as we came along. I dare say we shall be quite safe." She covered St. George with the veil, and Harry rubbed off as much as he could of the dragon poison onto St. George's armor, so as to make everything quite safe for him. "We might hide in the church till it is dark," he said, and then... But at that moment, a dark shadow fell on them, and they saw that it was a dragon, exactly the size of the dining room at home. So then they knew that all was lost. The dragon swooped down and caught the two children in his claws. He caught Effie by her green silk sash, and Harry by the little point at the back of his Eton jacket. And then, spreading his great yellow wings, he rose into the air, rattling like a third-class carriage when the brake is hard on. "Oh, Harry," said Effie, "I wonder when he will eat us." The dragon was flying across woods and fields with great flaps of his wings that carried him 1/4 of a mile at each flap. Harry and Effie could see the country below, hedges and rivers and churches and farmhouses flowing away from under them, much faster than you see them running away from the sides of the fastest express train. And still the dragon flew on. The children saw other dragons in the air as they went, but the dragon, who was as big as the dining room, never stopped to speak to any of them, but just flew on, quite steadily. "He knows where he wants to go," said Harry. "Oh, if only he would drop us before he gets there." But the dragon held on tight, and he flew and flew and flew until at last, when the children were quite giddy, he settled down, with a rattling of all his scales, on the top of a mountain. And he lay there on his great green scaly side, panting and very much out of breath, because he had come such a long way. But his claws were fast in Effie's sash and the little point at the back of Harry's Eton jacket. Then Effie took out the knife Harry had given her on her birthday. It had only cost 6 pence to begin with, and she had had it a month, and it never could sharpen anything but slate pencils. But somehow she managed to make that knife cut her sash in front, and crept out of it, leaving the dragon with only a green silk bow on one of his claws. That knife would never have cut Harry's jacket tail off, though, and when Effie tried for some time, she saw that this was so and gave up. But with her help, Harry managed to wriggle quietly out of his sleeves, so that the dragon only had an Eton jacket in his other claw. Then the children crept on tiptoe to a crack in the rocks and got in. It was much too narrow for the dragon to get in also, so they stayed in there and waited to make faces at the dragon when he felt rested enough to sit up and begin to think about eating them. He was very angry indeed when they made faces at him, and blew out fire and smoke at them, but they ran further into the cave so that he could not reach them, and when he was tired of blowing, he went away. But they were afraid to come out of the cave, so they went farther in, and presently the cave opened out and grew bigger, and the floor was soft sand. And when they had come to the very end of the cave, there was a door, and on it was written, "Universal Tap Room, Private, no one allowed inside." So they opened the door at once, just to peep in, and they remembered what St. George had said. "We can't be worse off than we are," said Harry, "with a dragon waiting for us outside. Let's go in." They went boldly into the tap room and shut the door behind them. And now they were in a sort of room cut out of the solid rock, and all along one side of the room were taps, and all the taps were labeled with china labels like you see in baths. And as they could both read words of 2 syllables, or even 3 sometimes, they understood at once that they had gotten to the place where the weather is turned on from. Isn't that just the way it goes, though, Sarah? Private, don't come in. We're going. I mean, to be fair, telling me not to do something is a pretty good way to make me do something. Just saying. Yeah. Here we go. There were 6 big taps, labeled sunshine, wind, rain, snow, hail, ice, and a lot of little ones, labeled fair to moderate, showery, south breeze, nice growing weather for the crops, skating, good open weather, south wind, east wind, and so on. And the big tap labeled sunshine was turned full on. They could not see any sunshine. The cave was lighted by a skylight of blue glass, so they supposed the sunlight was pouring out by some other way, as it does with the tap that washes out the underneath parts of patent sinks in kitchens. Then they saw that one side of the room was just a big looking glass, and when you looked in it, you could see everything that was going on in the world, and all at once, too. which is not like most looking glasses. They saw the carts delivering the dead dragons at the county council offices. I don't know why that's so hard for me. And they saw St. George asleep under the dragon-proof veil. And they saw their mother at home, crying because her children had gone out in the dreadful, dangerous daylight, and she was afraid a dragon had eaten them. And they saw the whole of England like a great puzzle map, green in the field parts and brown in the towns, and black in the places where they make coal and crockery and cutlery and chemicals. All over it, on the black parts and the brown and on the green, there was a network of green dragons. And they could see that it was still broad daylight and no dragons had gone to bed yet. Effie said dragons do not like cold, and she tried to turn off the sunshine, but the tap was out of order, and that was why there had been so much hot weather, and why the dragons had been able to be hatched. So they left the sunshine tap alone, and they turned on the snow, and left the tap full on while they went to go look at the glass. There they saw the dragons running all sorts of ways like ants, if you are cruel enough to pour water into an ant heap, which of course you never are. And the snow fell more and more. Then Effie turned the rain tap quite full on, and presently the dragons began to wriggle less, and by some of them lay quite still. So the children knew the water had put out the fires inside of them, and they were dead. So then they turned on the hail, only half on, for fear of breaking people's windows. And after a while, there were no more dragons to be seen moving. Then the children knew that they were indeed the deliverers of their country. "They will put up a monument to us," said Harry, "as high as Nelson's. All the dragons are dead." "I hope the one that was waiting outside for us is dead," said Effie. "And about the monument, Harry, I'm not so sure. What can they do with such a lot of dead dragons? It would take years and years to bury them, and they could never be burnt now they are soaking wet. I wish the rain would wash them off into the sea." But this did not happen, and the children began to feel that they had not been so frightfully clever after all. "I wonder what this old thing's for," said Harry. He had found a rusty old tap, which seemed as though it had not been used for ages. Its china label was quite coated over with dirt and cobwebs. When Effie had cleaned it with a bit of her skirt, for curiously enough that both children had come without pocket handkerchiefs, she found that the label said waste. "Let's turn it on," she said. "It might carry off the dragons." The tap was very stiff, from not having been used for a long time, but together they managed to turn it on, and then ran to the mirror to see what happened. Already, a great, round, black hole had opened up in the very middle of the map of England, and the sides of the map were tilting themselves, so that the rain ran down towards the hole. "Oh, hurrah, hurrah, hurrah!" cried Effie, and she hurried back to the taps and turned on everything that seemed wet. Showery, good open weather, nice growing weather for the crops, and even south and southwest, because she had heard her father say that these winds brought rain. And now the floods of rain were pouring down in the country, and great sheets of water flowed towards the center of the map, and cataracts of water poured into the great round hole in the middle of the map, and the dragons were being washed away and disappearing down the waste pipe in great green masses and scattered green shoals. Single dragons and dragons by the dozen, of all sizes, from the ones that carry off elephants down to the ones that get in your tea. Presently, there was not a dragon left. So then they turned off the tap named Waste, and they half turned off the one labeled Sunshine. It was broken, so they could not turn it off altogether. And they turned on Fair to Moderate and Showery, and both taps stuck, so that they could not be turned off, which accounts for our climate. How did they get home, then? By the Snowdon Railway, of course. And was the nation grateful? Well, the nation was very wet, and by the time the nation had gotten dry again, it was interested in the new invention for toasting muffins by electricity, and all the dragons were almost forgotten. Dragons do not seem so important when they are dead and gone, and you know, there never was a reward offered. And what did Father and Mother say when Effie and Harry got home? My dear, that is the sort of silly question you children will always ask. However, just for this once, I don't mind telling you. Mother said, "Oh, my darlings, you're safe. You're safe? You naughty children, how could you be so disobedient? Go to bed at once." And their father, the doctor, said, "I had wished I had known what you were going to do. I should have liked to preserve a specimen. I threw away the one I got out of Effie's eye. I intended to get a more perfect specimen. I did not anticipate this immediate extinction of the species." The professor said nothing, but he rubbed his hands. He had kept his specimen, the one the size of an earwig that he gave Harry half a crown for, and he has it to this day. You must get him to show it to you. Oh, I love these. I love these so much. These are such good little stories. All right. I'm going to take a little bit of a break right now. Everybody, please have some water. Refresh your tea, your coffee, whatever you're drinking. Take a little break. And we'll be back in about 10 minutes. Thank you. Hello, hello, my friends. Welcome back to Tea Time Tales. I am so excited you guys are enjoying all of my lovely stories today. I gotta say, I woke up this morning, I was so groggy, I was so tired, but I was like, gotta do the tales. So it means a lot for me to see you guys in my chat and hanging out and commenting on the stories. So thank you so much for being here. If we would like to check out the upcoming schedule for the next few weeks, we've got Jane Austen next week. Very excited. It's called Juvenilia, which is a series of stories that she wrote when she was very young. So Lady Susan, The Watsons, Sanditon, Love and Friendship, other works. So we might only get through one or two of those. They are still fairly lengthy, but I'm excited about those. And then the week after that is American Thanksgiving. Whoops. And I have this wonderful book here called Voices of the Winds. It is Native American legends, and so I'm really looking forward to this. I thought, as it is, Thanksgiving and all that, it would be just a nice thing to do to kind of spread some more American stories. So that's what's coming up. In December, I'm glad you're excited for Jane Austen. Me too. In December, we do have a audience request day. That is December 12th. Hold on. Let me just double check my schedule here. If you had ever like to look at the full schedule, it is in the Discord. So let's see. Okay, December 5th, we're doing King Arthur. And then the 12th is our audience request before our season finale for December 19th with holiday stories, mostly Christmas. But if you have a suggestion for December 12th, you can post it in the Discord. You can find the link to the Discord here. And you can also email me if you want to submit a story. You can send those to thebardicbelle@gmail.com. If you don't feel like joining the Discord, but I recommend you pop on over. It's a good group of people. We've got some things coming up this week at Chaotic Tiefling. We've got more The Quizzard and I, which is a lot of fun. You get to participate in trivia with Babs and a special guest. You can play through Twitch on the quiz kit. It's very simple to use. It's a lot of fun. And then, of course, there's going to be wine night, and then we'll be back again, of course, next week with Jane Austen. But yeah, I'm so glad you guys are here, and you can always follow me, of course, on Twitter if you like. I am at Bardic Belle on Twitter as well. And you can always message me there if you've got suggestions or comments. I'd love to talk about the stories afterwards with you guys, anything you'd like that. But I'm just going to have a little sip of water. Make sure you are staying hydrated, my dears. And then we're going to dive back into our Book of Dragons. All right. Oh, this one looks exciting. This has queens and witches in it. Pardon me. All right. This one in our Book of Dragons is called The Island of the Nine Whirlpools. The dark arch that led to the witch's cave was hung with a black and yellow fringe of live snakes. I love this already. Huzzah for witches indeed. The dark arch that led to the witch's cave was hung with a black and yellow fringe of live snakes. As the queen went in, keeping carefully in the middle of the arch, all the snakes lifted their wicked flat heads and stared at her with their wicked yellow eyes. You know it is not good manners to stare, even at royalty, except of course for cats. And the snakes had been so badly brought up that they even put their tongues out at the poor lady. Nasty, thin, sharp tongues they were, too. Now, the queen's husband was, of course, the king, and besides being a king, he was an enchanter, and considered to be at the top of his profession, so he was very wise, and he knew when kings and queens want children, the queen always goes to see a witch. So he gave the queen the witch's address, and the queen called on her, though she was very frightened and did not like it at all. The witch was sitting by a fire of sticks, stirring something bubbly in a shiny copper cauldron. "What do you want, my dear?" she said to the queen. "Oh, if you please," said the queen, "I want a baby. A very nice one. We don't want any expense spared. My husband and I." "Oh, yes," said the witch. "I know all about him. And so you want a child. Do you know it will bring you sorrow?" "It will bring me joy first," said the queen. "Great sorrow," said the witch. "Greater joy," said the queen. Then the witch said, "Well, have it your own way. I suppose it's as much your place as worth to go back without it." "Well, the king would be very much annoyed," said the poor queen. "Well, well," said the witch. "What will you give me for the child?" "Anything you ask for, and all I have," said the queen. "Then give me your gold crown." The queen took it off quickly. "And your necklace of blue sapphires." The queen unfastened it. "And your pearl bracelets." The queen unclasped them. "And your ruby clasps." And the queen undid the clasps. "Now the lilies from your breast." The queen gathered together the lilies, "and the diamonds of your bright shoe buckles." The queen pulled off her shoes. Then the witch stirred the stuff that was in the cauldron, and one by one she threw in the gold crown, and the sapphire necklace, and the pearl bracelets, and the ruby clasps, and the diamonds of the little bright shoe buckles. And last of all, she threw in the lilies. The stuff in the cauldron boiled up in foaming flashes of yellow and blue and red and white and silver, and sent out a sweet scent. And presently the witch poured it out into a pot, and set it to cool in the doorway among the snakes. Then she said to the queen, "Your child will have hair as golden as your crown, eyes as blue as sapphires. The red of your rubies will lie on its lips, and its skin will be as clear and pale as your pearls. Its soul will be white and sweet as your lilies, and your diamonds will be no clearer than its wits." "Oh, thank you," said the queen. "And when will it come?" "You will find it when you get home." "And won't you have something for yourself?" asked the queen. "Any little thing you fancy. Would you like a country or a sack of jewels?" "Nothing, thank you," said the witch. "I could make more diamonds in a day than I should wear in a year." "Well, but do let me do some little thing for you," the queen went on. "Aren't you tired of being a witch? Wouldn't you like to be a duchess or a princess or something like that?" "There is one thing I should rather like," said the witch, "but it's hard to get in my trade." "Oh, tell me what," said the queen. "I should like someone to love me," said the witch. Then the queen threw her arms around the witch's neck and kissed her 100 times. "Why," she said, "I love you better than my life. You've given me the baby, and the baby shall love you too." "Perhaps it will," said the witch. "And when the sorrow comes, send for me. Each of your 50 kisses will be a spell to bring me to you. Now drink up your medicine, there's a dear, and run along home." So the queen drank the stuff in the pot, which was quite cool by this time, and she went out under the fridge of snakes, and they all behaved like good Sunday school children. Some of them even tried to drop a curtsy to her as she went by, though that is not easy when you are hanging wrong way up by your tail. But the snakes knew the queen was friends with their mistress, so of course they had to do their best to be civil. When the queen got home, sure enough, there was the baby, lying in the cradle with the royal arms blazoned on it, crying as naturally as possible. It had pink ribbons to tie up its sleeves, so the queen saw at once it was a girl. When the king knew this, he tore his black hair with fury. "Oh, you silly, silly queen," he said. "Why didn't I marry a clever lady? Did you think I went to all the trouble and expense of sending you to a witch to get a girl? You knew well enough it was a boy I wanted, a boy, an heir, a prince, to to learn all my magic and my enchantments, and to rule the kingdom after me. I'll bet a crown, my crown, he said. You never even thought to tell the witch what kind you wanted, did you now? And the queen hung her head, and had to confess that she had only asked for a child. Very well, madam, said the king, very well, have your own way, and make the most of your daughter while she is a child. The queen did. All the years of her life had never held half so much happiness as now lived in each of the moments when she held her little baby in her arms. And the years went on, and the king grew more and more clever at magic, and more disagreeable at home, and the princess grew more beautiful and more dear every day she lived. The queen and the princess were feeding the goldfish in the courtyard fountains with crumbs of the princess's 18th birthday cake, when the king came into the courtyard, looking as black as thunder, with his black raven hopping after him. He shook his fist at his family, as indeed he generally did whenever he met them, for he was not a king with pretty home manners. The raven sat down on the edge of the marble basin and tried to peck the goldfish. It was all he could do to show that he was in the same temper as his master. A girl indeed, said the king angrily. I wonder you can dare to look me in the face when you remember how your silliness has spoiled everything. You oughtn't to speak to my mother like that, said the princess. She was 18, and it came to her suddenly and all in a moment that she was a grown-up, so she spoke up. The king could not utter a word for several minutes. He was too angry. But the queen said, My dear child, don't interfere, quite crossly, for she was frightened. And to her husband she said, My dear, why do you go on worrying about it? Our daughter is not a boy, it is true, but she may marry a clever man who could rule your kingdom after you, and learn as much magic as ever you cared to teach him. Then the king found his tongue. If she does marry, said the king, her husband will have to be a very clever man. Oh, yes, very clever indeed, and he will have to know a very great deal more magic than I shall ever care to teach him. And the queen knew at once by the king's tone that he was going to be disagreeable. Ah, she said, don't punish the child because she loves her mother. I'm not going to punish her for that, he said. I'm only going to teach her to respect her father. And without another word, he went off to his laboratory and worked all night, boiling different colored things in crucibles and copying charms and curious twisted letters from old brown books with mold stains on their yellowy pages. The next day, his plan was all arranged. He took the poor princess to the Lone Tower, which stands on an island in the sea, 1,000 miles from anywhere. He gave her a dowry and settled a handsome income on her. He engaged a competent dragon to look after her, and also a respectable griffin, whose birth and upbringing he knew all about. And he said, Here you shall stay, my dear respectful daughter, till the clever man comes to marry you. He'll have to be clever enough to sail a ship through the 9 whirlpools that spin around the island, and to kill the dragon and the griffin. Till he comes, you'll never get any older or any wiser. No doubt he will soon come. You can employ yourself in embroidering your wedding gown. I wish you joy, my dutiful child. And his carriage, drawn by live thunderbolts, thunder travels very fast, rose in the air and disappeared, and the poor princess was left with the dragon and the griffin on the island of the 9 whirlpools. The queen, left at home, cried for a day and a night, and then she remembered the witch and called to her. And the witch came, and the queen told her all. For the sake of the twice 25 kisses you gave me, said the witch, I will help you. But it is the last thing I can do, and it is not much. Your daughter is under a spell, and I can take you to her. But if I do, you will have to be turned to stone, and to stay so till the spell is taken off the child. I would be a stone for 1,000 years, said the poor queen, if at the end of them I could see my dear again. So the witch took the queen in a carriage drawn by live sunbeams, which travel more quickly than anything else in the world and much quicker than thunder. And so away and away to the lone tower on the island of the 9 whirlpools. And there was the princess sitting on the floor of the best room of the lone tower, crying as if her heart would break. And the dragon and the griffin were sitting primly on each side of her. Yeah. "Oh, mother, mother," she cried, and hung around the queen's neck as if she would never let go. "Now," said the witch, when they had all cried as much as was good for them, "I can do 1 or 2 little things for you. Time shall not make the princess sad. All days will be like one day till her deliverer comes. And you and I, dear queen, will sit in stone at the gate of the tower. In doing this for you, I shall lose all my witch's powers, and when I say the spell that changes you to stone, I shall change with you. And if we ever come out of the stone, I shall be a witch no more, but only a happy old woman." Then the 3 kissed one another again and again, and the witch said the spell, and on each side of the door there was now a stone lady. One of them had a stone crown on its head and a stone scepter in its hand, but the other held a stone tablet with words on it, which the griffin and the dragon could not read, though they both had had a very good education. And now all days seemed like one day to the princess, and the next day always seemed the day when her mother would come out of the stone and kiss her again. And the years went slowly by. The wicked king died, and someone else took his kingdom, and many things were changed in the world. But the island did not change, nor the 9 whirlpools, nor the griffin, nor the dragon, nor the 2 stone ladies. And all the time, from the very first, the day of the princess's deliverance was coming, creeping nearer and nearer and nearer. But no one saw it coming except the princess, and she only in dreams. And the years went by in 10s and in 100s, and still the 9 whirlpools swirled around, roaring in the triumph the story of many a good ship that had gone down in their swirl, bearing with it some prince who had tried to win the princess and her dowry, and had seen the whirlpools and had shaken their wise young heads and said, "'Bout ship," and gone discreetly home to their nice, safe, comfortable kingdom. But no one told the story of the deliverer who was to come. And the years went by. Now, after more scores of years than you would like to add up on your slate, a certain sailor boy sailed on the high seas with his uncle, who was a skilled skipper. And the boy could reef a sail and coil a rope and keep the ship's nose steady before the wind. And he was as good a boy as you would find in a month of Sundays, and worthy to be a prince. Now, there is something which is wiser than all the world, and it knows when people are worthy to be princes. And this something came from the farther side of the 7th world and whispered in the boy's ear. And the boy heard, though he did not know he heard, and he looked out over the black sea with white foam horses galloping over it, and far away he saw a light. And he said to the skipper, his uncle, "What light is that?" Then I'm sorry. You'll see why I laughed in a second. Then the skipper said, "All good things defend you, Nigel, from sailing near that light. It is not mentioned in all charts, but it is indeed marked on the old chart I steer by, which was my father's fathers before me, and his father's fathers before him. It is the light that shines from the lone tower that stands above the 9 whirlpools. And when my father's father was young, he heard from the very old man, his great-great-grandfather, that in that tower an enchanted princess, fairer than the day, waits to be delivered. But there is no deliverance, so never steer that way. And think no more of the princess, for that is only an idle tale. But the whirlpools are quite real." So, of course, from that day Nigel thought of nothing else, and as he sailed hither and thither upon the high seas, he saw from time to time the light that shone out to sea across the wild swirl of the 9 whirlpools. And one night, when the ship was at anchor and the skipper asleep in his bunk, Nigel launched the ship's boat and steered alone over the dark sea toward the light. He dared not go very near till daylight should show him what indeed were the whirlpools he had to dread. But when the dawn came, he saw the lone tower, standing dark against the pink and primrose of the east, and about its base the sullen swirl of black water, and he heard the wonderful roar of it. So he hung off and on, all that day, and for 6 days besides. And when he had watched 7 days, he knew something. For you are certain to know something if you give for 7 days your whole thought to it, even though it be only a first declension, or the 9 times table, or the dates of the Norman kings. What he knew was this, that for 5 minutes out of the 1,444 minutes that make up a day, the whirlpools slipped into silence. When the tide went down and left the yellow sand bare. And every day this happened, but every day it was 5 minutes earlier than it had been the day before. He made sure of this by the ship's chronometer, which he had thoughtfully brought with him. So on the 8th day, at 5 minutes before noon, Nigel got ready. And when the whirlpool suddenly stopped whirling and the tide sank, like water in a basin that has a hole in it, he stuck to his oars and put his back into his stroke, and presently beached the boat on the yellow sand. Then he dragged it into a cave and sat down to wait. By 5 minutes and 1 second past noon, the whirlpools were black and busy again, and Nigel peeped out of his cave. And on the rocky ledge overhanging the sea, he saw a princess, as beautiful as the day, with golden hair and a green gown, and he went out to meet her. "I've come to save you," he said. "How darling and beautiful you are." "You are very good and very clever and very dear," said the princess, smiling and giving him both her hands. He shut a little kiss in each hand before he let them go. "So now, when the tide is low again, I will take you away in my boat," he said. "But what about the dragon and the griffin?" asked the princess. "Dear me," said Nigel, "I didn't know about them. I suppose I can kill them." "Don't be a silly boy," said the princess, pretending to be very grown up, for though she had been on the island, time only knows how many years, she was just 18, and she still liked pretending. "You haven't a sword or a shield or anything." "Well, don't the beasts ever go to sleep?" "Why, yes," said the princess, "but only once in 24 hours, and then the dragon is turned to stone. But the griffin has dreams. The griffin sleeps at tea time every day, but the dragon sleeps every day for 5 minutes, and every day it is 3 minutes later than it was the day before." "What time does he sleep today?" asked Nigel. "At 11, said the princess. "Ah," said Nigel. "Can you do sums?" "No," said the princess sadly. "I was never good at them." "Then I must," said Nigel. "I can, but it's slow work, and it makes me very unhappy. It'll take me days and days." "Oh, don't begin yet," said the princess. "You'll have plenty of time to be unhappy when I'm not with you. Tell me about yourself." So he did, and then she told him all about herself. "I know I've been here a long time," she said, "but I don't know what time is, and I am very busy sewing silk flowers on a golden gown for my wedding day. And the griffin does the housework. His wings are so convenient and feathery for sweeping and dusting. And the dragon does the cooking. He's hot inside, so of course it's no trouble to him. And though I don't know what time is, I'm sure it's time for my wedding day, because my garden gown only wants one more white daisy on the sleeve, and a lily on the bosom of it, and then it will be ready." Just then they heard a dry, rustling clatter on the rocks above them, and a snorting sound. "It's the dragon," said the princess hurriedly. "Goodbye. Be a good boy and get your sum done," and she ran away and left him to his arithmetic. Now, the sum was this. If the whirlpools stop and the tide goes down once in every 24 hours, and they do it 5 minutes earlier every 24 hours, and if the dragon sleeps every day, and he does it 3 minutes later every day, in how many days and at what time in the day will the tide go down 3 minutes before the dragon falls asleep? It is quite a simple sum, as you see. You could do it in a minute because you have been to a good school and have taken pains with your lessons. but it was quite otherwise with poor Nigel. He sat down to work his sum in a piece of chalk on a smooth stone. He tried it by practice and the unitary method, by multiplication, by rule of 3 3/4. He tried it by decimals and compound interest. He tried it by square root and by cube root. He tried it by addition, simple and otherwise. And he tried it by mixed algebra, by simple and by quadratic equations, by trigonometry, by logarithms, and by conic sections. But it would not do. He got an answer every time, it is true, but it was always a different one, and he could not feel sure which answer was right. And just as he was feeling how much more important than anything else it is to be able to do your sums, the princess came back. And now it was getting dark. "Why, you've been 7 hours over that sum," she said, "and you haven't done it yet. Look here. This is what is written on the tablet of the statue by the lower gate. It has figures in it. Perhaps it is the answer to the sum." She held out to him a big white magnolia leaf, and she had scratched on it with the pin of her pearl brooch, and it had turned brown where she had scratched it, as magnolia leaves will do. Didn't know that. Nigel read, "After 9 days, T, 2, 24, D, 2, 27, ands, PS, and the griffin is artificial, R." He clapped his hands softly. "Dear princess, I know that's the right answer. It says R, too, you see, but I'll just prove it." So he hastily worked the sum backward in decimals and equations and conic sections and all the rules he could think of, and it came right every time. "So, now we must wait," he said. And they waited. And every day the princess came to see Nigel and brought him food cooked by the dragon, and he lived in his cave and talked to her when she was there and thought about her when she was not. And they were both as happy as the longest day in summer. And then at last came the day. Nigel and the princess laid their plans. "You're sure he won't hurt you, my only treasure?" said Nigel. "Quite," said the princess. "I only wish I were half as sure that he wouldn't hurt you." "My princess," he said tenderly, "two great powers are on our side. The power of love and the power of arithmetic. These two are stronger than anything else in the world." So, when the tide began to go down, Nigel and the princess ran out onto the sands, and there, in full sight of the terrace where the dragon kept watch, Nigel took his princess in his arms and kissed her. The griffin was busy sweeping the stairs of the lone tower, but the dragon saw, and he gave a cry of rage, and it was like 20 engines all letting off steam at the top of their voices inside Cannon Street Station. And the two lovers stood looking up at the dragon. He was dreadful to look at. His head was white with age, and his beard had grown so long that he caught his claws in it as he walked. His wings were white with the salt that had settled on them from the spray of the sea. His tail was long and thick and jointed and white, and had little legs to it, any number of them, far too many, so that it looked like a very large fat silkworm. And his claws were as long as lessons and as sharp as bayonets. "Goodbye, love," cried Nigel, and ran across the yellow sand towards the sea. He had one end of a cord tied to his arm. The dragon was clambering down the face of the cliff, and next moment he was crawling and writhing and sprawling and wriggling across the beach after Nigel, making great holes in the sand with his heavy feet at the very end of his tail. Where there were no legs made, as it dragged, a mark in the sand, such as you make when you launch a boat, and he breathed fire till the wet sand hissed again, and the water of the little rock pools got quite frightened, and all went off in steam. Still Nigel held on, and the dragon after him. The princess could see nothing for the steam, and she stood crying bitterly, but still holding on tight with her right hand to the other end of the cord that Nigel had told her to hold, while with her left hand she held the ship's chronometer, and looked at it through her tears as he had bidden her look, so as to know when to pull the rope. On went Nigel over the sand, and on went the dragon with him, and the tide was low, and sleepy little waves lapped the sand's edge. Now at the lip of the water, Nigel paused and looked back, and the dragon made a bound, beginning a stream of rage that was like all the engines of all the railways in England. But it never uttered the second half of that scream, for now it knew suddenly that it was sleepy. And it hurried back to dry land, because sleeping near whirlpools is so unsafe. But before it reached the shore, sleep caught it, and turned it to stone. Nigel, seeing this, ran shoreward for his life, and the tide began to flow in. And the time of the whirlpool's sleep was nearly over, and he stumbled, and he waded and swam, and the princess pulled for dear life at the cord in her hand, and pulled him onto the dry shelf of rock just as the great sea dashed in and made itself once more into the girdle of 9 whirlpools all around the island. But the dragon was asleep under the whirlpools, and when he woke up from being asleep, he found he was drowned. So there was an end of him. I feel like you could have just left while he was asleep. I don't know. Now there's only the griffin, said Nigel. And the princess said yes, only... And she kissed Nigel, and went back to sew the last leaf of the last lily on the bosom of her wedding gown. She thought and thought of what was written on the stone about the griffin being artificial. And the next day she said to Nigel, "You know, a griffin is half a lion and half an eagle, and the other 2 halves, when they're joined, make the Leo griff. But I've never seen him, yet I have an idea." So they talked over it and arranged everything. When the griffin fell asleep that afternoon at tea time, Nigel went softly behind him and trod on his tail. And at the same time the princess cried, "Look out! There's a lion behind you!" And the griffin, waking suddenly from his dreams, twisted his large neck around to look at the lion, saw a lion's flank, and fastened its eagle beak into it. For the griffin had been artificially made by the king enchanter, and the 2 halves had never really got used to each other. So now the eagle half of the griffin, who was still rather sleepy, believed that it was fighting a lion, and the lion part, being half asleep, thought it was fighting an eagle, and the whole griffin in its deep drowsiness hadn't the sense to pull itself together and remember what it was made of. So the griffin rolled over and over, one end fighting with the other, till the eagle end pecked the lion end to death, and the lion end tore the eagle end with its claws till it died. And so the griffin that was made of a lion and an eagle perished, exactly as if it had been made of Kilkenny cats. "Poor griffin," said the princess. "It was very good at the housework. I always liked it better than the dragon. It wasn't so hot-tempered." At that moment there was a soft, silky rush behind the princess, and there was her mother, the queen, who had slipped out of the stone statue at the moment the griffin was dead, and now came hurrying to take her dear daughter in her arms. The witch was clambering slowly off her pedestal. She was a little stiff from standing still so long. When they had all explained everything over and over to each other as many times as was good for them, the witch said, "Well, but what about the whirlpools?" And Nigel said he didn't know. And the witch said, "I'm not a witch anymore. I'm only a happy old woman, but I know some things still. Those whirlpools were made by the enchanter king's dropping of 9 drops of his blood into the sea. And his blood was so wicked that the sea has been trying ever since to get rid of it. And that made the whirlpools. Now, you only got to go out at low tide." So Nigel understood, and went out at low tide, and found in the sandy hollow left by the first whirlpool a great red ruby. That was the first drop of the wicked king's blood. The next day, Nigel found another, and next day another, and so on till the 9th day, and then the sea was as smooth as glass. The 9 rubies were used afterwards in agriculture. You only had to throw them out into a field if you wanted it plowed, and the whole surface of the land turned itself over in its anxiety to get rid of something so wicked, and in the morning the field was found to be plowed as thoroughly as any young man at Oxford. I don't think that means what it means now. So the wicked king did some good after all. When the sea was smooth, ships came from far and wide, bringing people to hear the wonderful story, and a beautiful palace was built, and the princess was married to Nigel in her gold dress, and they lived happily as long as was good for them. The dragon still lies, a stone dragon on the stand, and at low tide the little children play around him and over him. But the pieces that were left of the griffin were buried under the herb bed in the palace garden, because it had been so good at housework, and it wasn't its fault that it had been made so badly and put to such poor work as guarding a lady from her lover. I have no doubt that you will wish to know what the princess lived on during the long years when the dragon did the cooking. My dear, she lived on her income, and that is a thing that a great many people would like to be able to do. The ends of these stories are ridiculous. They're so silly. Oh my goodness. Oh boy. I don't know that I have enough in me for another story. I'd like to think that the queen and the old witch went and lived happily ever after off somewhere in a cottage, like a couple of old lesbians. You know, happy times. But anyway, I think that's going to be enough for today. Living on her income. Oh no, I know, right? Thank you so much again for joining me, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the stories. Next week, we're going to be back with Jane Austen. I'm very excited. I've never read her Juvenalia, so this will be fun. And again, after that, we're going to be doing Indigenous Native American stories the weekend of Thanksgiving. And then remember, the 12th of December, we're going to be having audience requests. So send those emails to thebardicbelle@gmail.com. You can post them in the Discord. You can tag me on Twitter. Whatever you like. And join us again next week. I look forward to seeing you all. Thank you so much for coming, guys. Have a great day.